Okay, the title of the message today from Exodus 1 is The Suffering of Israel and the Promise of God. The Suffering of Israel and the Promise of God. I had said in the last message that these first two chapters of Exodus you could kind of put under this subheading, the Lord's hidden providence. And I mean that, certainly, but as we go through here, I think we'll see, particularly in chapter 1, why it is I describe this chapter as both the suffering of Israel and then juxtaposition with that is the promise of God, or the promises of God, you could even say. What I would like to do today is to read all of Exodus chapter 1 and 2, though we will just cover Exodus chapter 1. Before we do that, let's pray, ask for the Lord's help in all we undertake here today. Father God, we come and ask you to be with us and to bless us in a special way today as we look at what will certainly prove to be a difficult topic for all of us. It's a difficult topic for every Christian, every believer in God, every unbeliever who in any way gives a bit of serious thought to what happens in the world. We sang about it over and over again in the songs we sang this morning. It is an abiding issue for your people. Suffering and your promises and how we think about existing in the realm of both of those things. And so I pray that you'd bring some light, some clarity, both to that issue and also to this text and the history of God's people here in Egypt, that we might learn from it all that we can. We are not unaware that these things were written for our sake. So we come expectant, eager to learn and to be equipped. In Christ's name we ask these things and pray for His glory and honor in our lives. Amen. Exodus chapter 1 and 2. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. And then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other Puah. When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Now, a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river bank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, This is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Go. So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, because she said, I drew him out of the water. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, the two Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, Why do you strike your companion? And he answered, Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? And then Moses was afraid and thought, Surely the thing is known. And when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. When they came home to their father Reuel, he said, How is it that you have come home so soon today? And they said, An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and even drew water for us and watered the flock. And he said to his daughters, Where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread. And Moses was content to dwell with the man. And he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. She gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. During those many days the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. All right. Well, the message today, again, Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 22, the entirety of chapter 1. I read all of chapters 1 and 2, though, because I think they're a unit, and they go together, and they're short enough we could read them. It's not like an 8-chapter section. That section as a whole, I think, really consists of maybe 3 parts if we were to exclude verses 23 and 24, and just 3 parts. And those would be this. There's a connecting introduction, verses 1 through 7, kind of, I say a connecting introduction, connecting the book of Exodus with the book of Genesis. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And then the second section is all just really all of chapter 1, explaining the persecution of the people of Israel. That's just what that persecution looked like is the rest of chapter 1. And then the next section, God's preservation of a boy named Moses. Maybe I said 3 sections. I mean 4 sections in this whole group. The first 10 verses of Exodus, chapter 2, God's preservation of a boy named Moses. And then verses 11 through 22 would be Moses desires to deliver his people, but has to seek safety from Midian, or in Midian, from Pharaoh. So those 4 things. An introduction, then this persecution is explained and elaborated. Some examples are given. Then we see God preserves this boy named Moses, and then we see Moses desiring to deliver his people, but having instead to flee and seek safety in Midian. And so that's kind of the things that happen here. Today we'll just be considering the first 2 of those sections, this connecting introduction, and then the explanation of the persecution of the people of Israel. So first of all, this idea of a connecting introduction. Before we even talk about what Moses wrote in these 7 verses and connecting this book, the way he connects this book to Genesis in those 7 verses, I want to first just say what we as readers ought to do. We ought to be bringing some things in ourselves. These connections, I think, are clearly intended by Moses. One of the first things that we'll consider before we jump ourselves back into Genesis is what is, in most of your Bibles in front of you, the non-translated word. The word that's not in your Bible, but that's in the Bible. Those of you who have a New American Standard, if you would look at Exodus chapter 1 and verse 1 and read to me the first word. Now. Does anyone have that word in the ESV? No, you don't. The New American Standard and the New King James Bible and the Amplified Bible, which is, it's not really modern necessarily anymore, but those 3 translations are the only really modern translations that have that word in there. They all say, now. There are some Bible translations you may at times find helpful that you come across every now and again, so-and-so's literal translation. There's a Young's literal translation. There's Darby's translation. Both of those include the word in it, but instead of now, it's and. And. And that's the word. It's a curious word to start a book with, and. But that's there. That might make us think there's good reason, because so few translations include the word. Maybe there's a good reason for not translating it that way or not including it. It's odd to start a book out with that word, and, after all. And so for that reason, most translations don't translate the word. It doesn't appear to add anything necessarily to the beginning. For instance, the New King James, the NASB, the Amplified, King James, all these include, it's translated as now. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel, as though it's just starting off. But really, I think it's supposed to be a continuation. And I say that because of how that word or that prefix that is used so much just in Hebrew in general, but I could just give you a couple demonstrations of that. It's fine to properly translate it now, or and, or then, that kind of thing, but it generally is used to, like in Genesis, it was always used to show, like when the story, they'd give an introductory material and they'd say, now we're going to start the actual story and begin to tell you the consecutive events that kind of happen throughout the story. As Moses narrates things, he wants you to go from this event to this event, and then think about that event, and then this, and then this. And he's moving things along, and that's what that form of sort of a verbal form is used for. Now, it gets added onto things as a prefix to indicate a succession from one thing to another, typically. And so let's just look at a couple of those places in the text that we just read. Chapter 1, verse 8. What does the ESV say? Now there arose a new king over Egypt. You see, we gave this introductory material and say, now that that's out of the way, understand this. Now there arose a new king over Egypt. Okay? How about verse 9? And he said to his people, or we could say, and then, or and next, or the next thing you should be aware of is this other thing. I want to add to this. And so it's just a consecutive thing. Verse 15. What do you have? What's your first word? Then. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives. You see, it's the next thing. How about chapter 2, verse 1? Now. Chapter 2, verse 5. Now the daughter of Pharaoh. You see, and his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Well, now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. You see, we're introducing this new material that is the next thing, the next significant thing to talk about. Chapter 2, verse 16. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and so it's this way. This is the way the word is used so often, and it's important because it directly connects all of Exodus with the previous book of Genesis. To say, now the next thing. If you read a book that way that said "and," you would say "and." Well, what is this? The next step in, or the next stage of? What are we talking about? This is one developing story from Genesis into Exodus. Just as Luke begins Acts by describing the connection between Acts and his previous version, in which he says, "In the first book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day when he was taken up, after he had given commands through the Holy Spirit to the apostles whom he had chosen." He could have just well said, "and." Right? "And these other things are also true, which you should know." And this began his story, but he filled it out for us there. But it's the same idea. Moses is connecting these books. It's a mistake to read this as another whole separate kind of thing. And not remember the many connections about these events. 9 times in the book of Exodus we read of the 3 patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who they don't do anything in this book. They're all dead. For hundreds of years they've been dead. But this is what we read about. 9 times we read about them and the promises God made to them. So some texts that I think are very important for us to keep in mind. Genesis chapter 15. Turn with me there. Genesis chapter 15. This is certainly important. Genesis 15, verses 13 through 21. Here we will read about the timing of the events in Exodus and the treatment of the people of Israel in Egypt. Genesis 15, verse 13. You remember this is after Abram, still at this point, had delivered Lot and rescued all the people of these 5 cities who were overthrown, right? And he comes back and he makes an offering to Melchizedek, and then the king of Sodom comes and tries to barter with him, and he says, "I won't take anything." But that leaves him then with nothing, when it seemed like this was a really good opportunity for God to make of Abram a great nation and to give him the land because the cities were emptied. And instead he walks out with nothing. Abraham begins to get worried that maybe things aren't going to happen, maybe he screwed something up. And God gives him this vision. In the vision he assures him that he is, because he believes God, that's all God is requiring, his faith alone is going to count as doing his end of the bargain. And God's going to do his end of things, that God will surely bring it to pass. Will give them the land and give him children. And Abram is still a little bit concerned and has further questions, and God says, basically, "I'll make a covenant with you." And in this vision that Abram has, we come to verse 13. Then the Lord said to him, and this is the promise, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants or slaves there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. That's a lot of ites, and that's the point. I'm going to give you all that land. And I swear I'll make a covenant with you. He'll do that. But notice some things that are remarkable and which should set the stage for us about what's going to happen in these intervening years. Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs. They will come down and be people who stay in a place, but who don't have any real possessions there. It is not their land. They'll be sojourners somewhere else. And will be servants or slaves there. They'll be made to be slaves. And they will be afflicted for 400 years. So for a 400-year period, they will be under affliction during their time. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. So even though they will live as sojourners without things, and they will be afflicted as slaves, at the end of this, God will bring, don't miss this, bring judgment. Not, I'll deliver you. That will happen too, but I will bring judgment upon that other nation. And afterward they shall come out with great possessions. They're going to be rich when they come out. I want you to pair verses 14 and 16 here to help us with this. God's going to bring judgment on the nation they serve. But why can't God just give the Israelites the land now? Why can't He give Abram and his descendants the land now? Verse 16, and they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. God doesn't yet want to bring judgment on the Amorites yet, the people of this land, because they're not deserving of it yet. Not like Sodom and Gomorrah and those places were. These people aren't as wicked yet, but that time is coming. But who gets judged before the Amorites? We know it. It's the Egyptians. The nation they serve will afflict them and mistreat them in their slavery. And God will rise up and judge them. So in terms of how relatively bad it will be to be a slave in Egypt during this time, very bad. God will judge them before He judges the Amorites. It's not right for God to judge the Amorites, He says, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. It's not full. It's not up to the measure which invites and provokes my wrath to the degree that I plan to unleash it. But the Egyptians, it'll happen to them first. What a thing. So just let that sit there in your mind as you think about the nature of slavery in Egypt for the Israelites when things turned, how badly they turned, how wicked it was. It will be hard and cruel for a long, long time. There will be a mistreatment that invites and stores up the very wrath of God to bring His judgment. It'll be delayed for hundreds of years, but it will come. That's one text. Genesis chapter 46. Verses 1 through 4. We touched on this a little bit when we went through Genesis, but the connection is clear when we're in Exodus for sure. In Genesis 46, verses 1 through 4, we read about the fear and dread of Jacob, or of Israel, as his name became, in leading his family down to Egypt to reunite with his son Joseph. And this is amazing, right? Chapter 46, verse 1. So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here am I. Then he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. So this consolation that God gives Jacob, he's coming. Israel is traveling down to meet his son. You know he was overjoyed to meet his son, to see him. There was no greater desire he had, and yet he did not want to go to Egypt. Why? I think two reasons. Number one, things never went well for his family anytime they ever left the promised land. Like, he's got a couple generations where they figured that out now. And so he's fearful to leave. But number two, you have this word that they're going to go be sojourners. They are leaving now with everything, all of their possessions, to go to a foreign land where God told his grandfather, they didn't know what land, but they're going to go to a land, be sojourners, and be mistreated for 400 years. How would you not be fearful? But God tells him, not just, I will bring you up again. He knew that part. That was going to happen. But God says, I will go with you. I myself will go down with you to Egypt. And I think that's the reassuring part. Yes, God will bring us back. That matters, but God also will go with us. And so that ought to be in our mind, that God is it's not just these things happening to the people until God shows up again, but God is with them in the affliction. God assured Israel of this. He would be with them when they're there. He would be with them to bring about his promises to Jacob. Despite how things may go, they will eventually turn out to fulfill the promises God has made. God will see it through, and God won't abandon his people. We also read later in Genesis 46 about the 70 descendants of Jacob who came down to Egypt with him, plus more, because those were just the male descendants. We read in Genesis 47 about the family being put into the service of Pharaoh. This is important. I made a big deal of this when we went through this as well, the connections, how this sets us up for Exodus. We read in Genesis 47 about the family being put into the service of Pharaoh, and also that they have a stipend from Pharaoh, that they get their sustenance from him. They're exempt also from taxes. All this was a tremendous benefit and honor given to them for the sake of Joseph. Right? I mean, they had all the best jobs. They had food and sustenance direct from Pharaoh's house, or from his purse, you might say. And then also they were exempt from taxes, all because Joseph was so honored. This is what Pharaoh sought willingly. He didn't owe it to Joseph's family, but he honored them for the sake of Joseph at his own expense. But otherwise, don't miss this, they are all servants of Pharaoh. They're all in his service. He employs them. We read about in Genesis 50 about the death of Joseph and the honor of the Israelites among the Egyptians because of him, that they continued to honor them because of Joseph. This great funeral that was had and all this sort of thing. This was a big deal. The people of Israel were exempted from so much hardship even that the Egyptians had to undergo because they were connected to Joseph. And that's how the book ends. How much, you might ask, did the people of Israel remind themselves of these promises and these events? Like we want to remind ourselves of them as we read Exodus, but how much were they reminding themselves of it? Well, it's hard to say a little bit. It's certainly true that they were crying out to God in their circumstances toward the end of this intense persecution. That's 400 years. That's a long time to still be crying out to God. So it wasn't as if they'd all forgotten. It's also true that they recognized the names of their ancestors. Tell them, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They didn't say who, which means they knew the stories and they knew the names. Now, they might not have known them. There might have been some good reason for Moses to write the book of Genesis to clarify some of the things that had been propagated among the Israelites about things that had happened and twists on the story and pagan influences and things like that to get this clear. But at least they knew the men, and they surely were vaguely aware of the promises. At least as a cultural people. Some of these stories, if not all, were known to the people. Certainly the stories were passed down, but also certainly at least some of them were still common cultural knowledge among them some 400 years into their slavery. It doesn't appear, however, you think, well, 400 years. It doesn't appear that a reckoning of years was part of their thinking as it had been for Daniel in Babylon. He's like, I discerned 70 years, and so I started praying. We don't read that they discerned 400 years, and so they began to pray. And it's a little bit difficult. And part of that, I think, is difficult to understand because of when do you start the clock at 400 years? Is it just when this Pharaoh arises who doesn't know Joseph? Probably not. Probably starts to kind of not be great before then. And we'll look at some things in the text that indicate that very clearly. So let's do that then. Let's dive in Exodus chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. That is a very long introduction, but we are basically halfway through my notes. So verses 1 through 7. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan and Naphtali; Gad and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. You see, we're assuming all of this stuff that you know about things from Genesis. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Okay, so starting out, we have this list of names. This is listed in order of mother, not in birth order. But that is exactly, there's another list of all of these names. It's an exact quote of that list. One of the ways that they were ordered and arranged. We begin to read at the very beginning, at the outset here, about two rails of this story, and they have to do with my title. But on the one hand is the increasing negative treatment of the people by the Egyptians. And on the other hand is the blessing of God to fulfill His promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which we take with us from the book of Genesis into Exodus. We've got all these promises. These promises will be mentioned specifically later on, but as readers, we bring them with us in our memories of what was promised, much like at least some of the people of Israel were doing this during this time. So Joseph dies, and all his brothers and all that generation. What do we make of this? This undoubtedly was a great blow to the people. Think of this. Gone was all of that generation. All of them. Now the people who were left were only those who only knew Egypt. Some perhaps, maybe the old heads had childhood memories of the Promised Land, but they too were soon dead. And you had a group of people who were born in Egypt and lived all their days in Egypt. This is what would have happened. When all that generation dies, there's just no one left who has any living memory of anything from those times. You have something that was passed down to you as Pharaoh himself gave my grandfather this very whatever, and when we have it, and we keep it or whatever. But that's kind of all you have. There's no real memory of all this other than the stories that you're told. The descendants of Jacob were but an Egyptian people, separate from Egyptians, but they were Egyptian in geography. They had never known anywhere else. You got a people who are promised a land that they've never seen or been to. They don't have a home. They're sojourners in a foreign land. And they're in the service of Pharaoh. This was the situation after Joseph and his brothers and all that generation died. But they were fruitful, it says. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied. What a thing. These words ought to remind us of the garden blessing of God upon Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply. Also, to Noah after the flood of judgment was said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And we read here about these people, what did they do? It says they grew exceedingly strong so that the land was filled with them. But those two things, they grew exceedingly strong and the land was filled with them, become a problem. If you think politically for a moment, if you are a king of a people and you have servants, and those servant class, those slaves, become strong and numerous, very numerous, you begin to worry. What do you worry about? Anyone? What do you worry about? Right, a revolt. This is a problem. They might overthrow you. And so this is what we read about. These last two things become a political concern for Pharaoh. Let's look at verses 8 through 10. And we read about here in these three verses the rationale, the reasoning for turning against the people of Israel. Why turn against them? It was so good. You honored them before. Why turn against them? Well, verse 8, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. That's the first thing. Now, it's not that it's not saying this was the first Pharaoh who didn't personally know Joseph. You may have already had one of those. This was the first one who didn't know, he didn't acknowledge, didn't recognize Joseph. Joseph didn't mean anything to him. Right? You could think of it, and I don't mean to make any sort of a political statement about this at all, other than just it's a fact of history. Like you have in the South, right? We have these monuments to these Confederate generals. And what's happening in our generation? They're being torn down. They're not anything to us. Or they're not anything to people that live there now. Like they're not, at one point they wanted to erect this monument. Now, it doesn't mean anything to them. Right? So this is the difference. You got a community that once donated money to build this thing, now they're tearing it down. This is what we ought to think of. He didn't know Joseph. It's not telling me, oh, but remember Joseph 60 years ago? Remember what he did? That doesn't matter. We don't care about that. This man does not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Now, the new king didn't know him personally. He recognized no obligations to especially honor any of his descendants. And in that context, you just begin to look at things as this political ruler, and he says, look, we've got these people, and they're mighty, and they're many, and they're my servants, my slaves. I don't want them to get away. I don't want them to get away. The people evidently had continued in service for some time and were basically now seen just as servants for years now. Though they had been honored in some ways, that is over now. Think about this. It's likely that their protected status from taxes and the benefit of a stipend from Pharaoh's house had ceased long ago. What do I mean by that? I mean, just think about this. It's one thing for Joseph and all of his brothers and their houses, as they come to Egypt, to be exempt from tax. But when they all have their kids, do they all get exempt too? And then some of them move or whatever. Are they still exempt? And then they have children. Are they all still exempt now too? I mean, it gets kind of ridiculous. It's like, claiming I get a scholarship for college because my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was half Indian or something. It's like, no. At some point, you're not connected enough to this person we're meaning to honor. And if that person we mean to honor doesn't mean anything to the guy in charge, then you really don't matter. And so these things have likely ceased long ago. But they are totally done now. This has to be the case that most of these privileges stopped long ago, or the Egyptians would not have worried about the Israelites that they might want to join an invading army to get a better position and freedom. You think of this. He says, let's do this, lest if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape. Well, if they've been a privileged, honored people, they're not worried about escaping. And if you have all this time we've been living with them and we've been paying taxes to provide them for food, we're not worried about they might escape. It's like, go. We'll stop feeding you and we can just benefit from the taxes we pay ourselves. But that's not how it is. Instead, they're worried they might escape, which means they were all aware they were profiting greatly from the Israelites being there, which means their period of slavery began before this time. So in the interval time between Joseph and when he dies, and when this Pharaoh rises, things have already been going badly for the Israelites. At what point do you start the clock of 400 years? It's hard to say. What step was it when it became part of the 400 years that God intended to talk about them being afflicted? I don't know. At least with this Pharaoh, probably before him, but certainly with him. Does it start the moment people begin to look for escape? Or rather, when they hem them in these ways to deal shrewdly with them so that there could never be an escape? But right here at the outset, we are also primed to think about a clash of God and their whole religious system here. Because God's promised, I will bring them up. And Pharaoh says, don't let them escape. We're not going to let them escape. What a thing. Lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. So between the lack of honor, no longer being honored for Joseph's sake, and then between not honoring them, and then Pharaoh has this fear of losing so vast a number of servants, or even the possibility of the people joining an invading army, the king was concerned that the people of Israel would escape from the land. So he took counsel about how to deal shrewdly with them to keep them from multiplying from so much and from seeking any escape. Right? There are too many of them, too mighty, so let's deal with them shrewdly, lest they multiply and fight against us and try to escape. So what does that look like? I mean, I know we read some details about it in a minute, but just some of that is just their summary statements. And so they made them work ruthlessly and this kind of thing. But I want you to think about psychologically. He says we're going to deal shrewdly with them. This is a politician. He's looking at this and saying, how do we make it so that they don't want to escape? And they don't have it. They're no longer looking to get out. And how do we keep them from multiplying while still being our slaves? We don't want to read on just yet. Too often we just read quickly here and don't realize the point of Pharaoh's actions that follow. His goal is to keep the population from multiplying, and his goal is to demoralize them so that they no longer seek freedom or anything better. That's his intention. So the work is meant to shorten their span of life and fill their days with misery so there's not energy to multiply, nor is any hope of something better. And so you ought to read these descriptions that follow in the worst sort of way. You should imagine the worst. How would you treat people to try to get them to never hope for anything better than they have now? To think that their life is just kind of worthless. There's no value except what they can get done. And we don't want them to multiply, so really if we lose a bunch of them on the way, it's okay. Right? So they're going to treat your life as nothing. Right? This is what happens. Well, verses 11 through 14, the beginning of this persecution. Therefore, if that's their goal, therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So this affliction in their work. But to no avail, they continued to multiply and spread and fill the land. Why? Why did that happen? This doesn't make sense. I mean, this would be an effective strategy, wouldn't it? And it worked in America in our dark history, surely, right? This is what you do to a people who are who are multiplying in the land, outnumber you, and yet you are not willing to treat them as equals in any way. You do not want them to get out of your authority and your power and your command as to what to do. They are slaves. You mean to keep them as slaves. You demoralize them. You kill them for slight offenses. You don't care. And you make it known you don't care. And they just don't keep multiplying. I mean, in our country, what do we have to do? We have to keep shipping them in. That's how effective we were in not letting them continue to multiply. We can't keep enough alive, right? It's amazing. Yeah, they're multiplying some ways, but not like they could be if we didn't treat them this way. Well, don't stop treating them that way. You need more. Don't be nice and just let them have more kids. Keep being ruthless. Go buy more if you need to. It's amazing. It was effective there. Why not here? Because God was with them. God said, I'll be with you. God said, you're going to grow. You're going to become a mighty nation. It didn't matter how Pharaoh treated them. It didn't matter how the Egyptians themselves treated their slaves, how the taskmaster treated them, what they did. It didn't matter. How many of these Israelites they killed in process of and making their work hard and awful and ruthlessly treated them, they continued to prosper. Well, how long does it have to go? I mean, if they did this for a year, you wouldn't really be able to tell, are the people still multiplying? This is generations. Again, we're talking about 400 years of affliction. I don't know to what extent these 400 years exist, but I can say this. If archaeologists are correct at all about these two cities that were likely built, and there's differing opinions, but they were built toward the beginning of the 400 years. And then much later than the people of Israel came out. And so, likely this is maybe not the starting place of the 400 years, but it's toward the beginning of that 400 years. They built these cities. Store cities. Can you imagine? But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. They were in dread. This was a cultural thing, right? You're an Egyptian, natural born, you're there and you see these Israelites everywhere. These Hebrews, these people who are on the outskirts of society, who we despise, who are multiplying, who in Pharaoh's service, who are now we treat, they're slaves, maybe not your slave, but they're slaves of Pharaoh. And all these guys that work for Pharaoh are in charge of them. And they're there in the market, and they're there everywhere. And you can't help but feel like this is not going to go well. And so you join Pharaoh in treating them terribly. You despise them. The whole culture is against them. The entire people. And they are in dread of them. So now, if I'm the average Egyptian, I may or may not have Hebrew slaves. But even if I don't, I join. Now Pharaoh has my consent. All the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. What kind of work in the field? Well, there's not tractors. What needs to be done? Okay, have them do that. Well, they got that done pretty quick. Let's make it a little harder. I've always wondered if we could move all this hill over there. My sunset would be a little better. They're just slaves. All kinds of work in the field. Whatever. Just whatever you can think of. If it's hard, make them do it. Give it to them. The goal isn't just to get things done. The goal, yes, we like these slaves and they're useful to get things done, but the goal is also to keep them demoralized and to limit their population. That's the intent. That's why this started. This is amazing. And listen to the way this is just underscored so much. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work. They made them work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. I mean, it's like I got the picture, but he's filling it out for us and emphasizing it so we don't miss what it meant to be an Israelite in Egypt at this time was hard work under ruthless oppressors. And there was no one who wasn't an Israelite who sympathized with you in any way. And as we read on, even your Israelite, you might get in a duel with him. Like you didn't even get along. Life was miserable. But don't forget, despite all of this, the people were multiplying and spreading in the land. They were not protected from this treatment. You'd think God would make them a mighty nation. What would it mean for God to be with you? Well, for these things not to happen to you, right? God is with us. And these things are happening to us, but we're multiplying. Yes, I can think of 17 of my friends who died in the last year, beaten by their master. But God's with us, and we can't be stopped. That's what a conviction for any of them to have had that belief. It's incredible. Now, I don't say we read about all these men with this great conviction. I just mean this was a time of severe trial. But the fact is, whether they believed it or not, we read it, we know God was with them. He'd promised to be with them. There's nothing else that can explain the way they continued to multiply and prosper. God is still fulfilling His promises in the midst of it. They had done nothing wrong. There's no sin mentioned as to why they're in these circumstances. Right? It's not as a judgment for something they've done. We're not told anything like that. Instead, we were told ahead of time, before these people were born or had done anything, that they were going to be slaves, were going to be badly treated, but God would, and then God promises to Jacob, I'll be with you and I'll be with them and I'll bring you all out of here. So God is with them in these terrible circumstances, but they're not being punished. Rather, they're having to be patient as God waits for the iniquity of the Amorites to be complete, and while the Egyptians fill up the cup of God's anger toward them, that they might be judged for their cruelty. In the meantime, the people of Israel are the punching bag, and they are also learning from experience what it's like to be a people under an earthly king and under men, under the greatness and the wealth and the power of earthly powers of Egypt. One day they'll learn the difference between serving God and serving Pharaoh. The difference is great, and the difference is glorious. But for now, they're suffering. We could look at this and say, how is that fair? Well, we could say, God has that right to leave you in circumstances in the world, right? Does God have to hem you in and protect you on every side all the time? Is He not free to pull back His protection and let the forces of this world, which destroy one another, at you for a while too? Surely. He's not wrong in doing that. He's never promised us He would keep that from us. He's told us, in fact, to expect it. And they were going through it. We read this in a chapter and we forget 400 years. 400. We haven't been in a country for 400 years. 400 years. I mean, think about how much can change in 400 years. Or we could read here, how much could not change in 400 years. I mean, you got kids, the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandkids of some of these Israelites who are still in slavery. It was their great-great-great-grandparents who built these store cities. And all these years later, here they are, still slaves. And it's worse than it ever was. It just keeps getting worse. What a thing. God has many purposes for the people of Israel. But for now it falls on them to endure, merely to suffer, to not forget the promises, not forget that God preserves them, blesses them, and will deliver them one day. They're to remember that. Now the persecution gets worse, verses 15 and following. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because of the midwives feared God, He gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. All right. Adam, I'm going to put you on the spot here. And you may not have an answer, and that's fair. Any idea, I didn't bother to look it up, how many children maybe a week are born in Hannibal, the hospital up there? No idea. Okay. Leah, do you venture a guess since you years ago had been in. What's that? Okay. Well, I don't know what it is, but it's more than one or two. It's more than 4 or 5. It's quite a few. And you've got 2 midwives who are mentioned here. I'll just say this. There are probably hundreds of midwives. These 2 are probably over all the other midwives. They're the ones who are answerable to Pharaoh. Like everything else in Egypt, there was kind of layers to this stuff. And there's no, if these were the only 2, then they did not lie. Before they can get there, they already gave birth. Every time. It never fails. They can never get there in time. Right? So either they're the only midwives who never midwife, like they were wrongly trained. There's no reason for them to be called midwives because they never do that. They never help women in the process of giving birth because they always show up and they're already born. It's just the way it works. We just kind of come and make sure everything is good after. Clean up. That's all we do. Like that's not, midwives do a lot of that a lot of times, but that is not what a midwife is. That's not what we mean when we think about this. An old practice, right? And it's not as common today, but it's still certainly true. I mean, the midwife would serve as this woman to come in alongside a birthing mother to help her through the labor and the early stages of having that child. Like very early, just kind of helping her along a bit. Now, this was a common profession. You know, it's very common. And so here these women are. And there are 2 who are, King of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shipra and the other Puah, when you serve. So they're specifically mentioned by name. It's a bit of an irony that they are mentioned by name, but the Pharaoh and the King of Egypt is not mentioned by name. He doesn't get a name. But these 2 women do, and they're honored. When you serve as, what's the command? When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. Now, can I just ask, I think this is it's a reach for Pharaoh. Like he has the authority to command these things. I mean, he's wrong to do it, but like he has the earthly power to insist upon this. But like midwives, I can't picture like a midwife who's like, I'm going to kill the baby. Like midwives are people who like genuinely care. That's why they do it. They could do lots of other things maybe. Now maybe there's some of them who are like, I hate my job. You know, it's like, and that happens. But most of them, they're doing this because, and they're good at it, because, especially if they've risen to this place of prominence, they're good at it. They're efficient. They're able to teach the others what to do. They're able to show them a proper bedside manner. Those are not the people you say, when the baby is born, kill him. Like, it's just not likely to work. And that's exactly what we find. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. Now, there's some dispute here. Were these Hebrew women who were midwives among Hebrew women, or were these Egyptian women who performed the role of a midwife, or who were over the Hebrew midwives? Does that make sense? Like, were the midwife, because it's just the midwives of the Hebrews. I was like, well, do we mean like the midwives among the Hebrews, like they were Hebrew themselves, or do we mean the midwives who functioned as midwives among the Hebrew people? What do you mean? It's just not clear. So there's arguments maybe on both sides. On the one side, you'd say it's not likely that an Egyptian woman, because people were in such dread over the people of Israel, it's not like, and they despised them and all this kind of stuff, it's not likely that they would want to serve as midwives. However, if they were serving as midwives and they had that dread, it'd be pretty reasonable for Pharaoh to say, kill the male. Then you'd think, well, they would probably do it. But these women, in contrast to that expectation, had a fear of God and said no, and they refused. That seems pretty likely. But it's also possible, it seems more likely, and I don't mean I like this other option better, but the positives about another option are, on the other side of things, is it's likely that the Hebrew midwives would have been Hebrews. And it's very likely that they naturally would be ones who had fear of God and who refused, in spite of fear of Pharaoh. Like, they wouldn't naturally want to do this. They would refuse it because it's their people. But there's such fear of Pharaoh, and they're in these circumstances where People are dying left and right who are slaves. Nobody cares about them. They do, if they've elevated through the ranks, they've made some compromises maybe already. They're in a place now where they're directly answerable to Pharaoh. It's a fearful thing to disobey Pharaoh. And in spite of that temptation, they still held on to their fear of God and refused. I can see either scenario. I've read men and heard from men who are vehement about one position or the other. I don't know. Regardless, these two women, the names they are given are certainly Hebrew names, but they could be converts. It could be that they're honored with these names. Maybe they were given those names by the Hebrew women. They had served as midwives earlier in their career, and now they still use them. That's how the Hebrews know them. We don't know an answer to any of that. But we do know they feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this? And let the male children live." Could you imagine being called to account and having to go stand before Pharaoh in that meeting? I mean, that is fearful. Why have you done this and let the male children live? Now, this is probably not something that happened the next week. But after a period of time when Pharaoh's like, wait a minute, it seems like when I passed through that town to observe some of the work, I saw some infant boys. I thought they were all dead, right? That kind of a thing, likely. Or maybe he just got a report. But whatever happens, he comes and he calls them to him. Why have you done this and let the male children live? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. Now, there's part of this that could ring true, certainly because of their work, they would be more vigorous. And I would venture to say, anecdotally, I feel like this is true in my own experience when I see this happen among women. But I don't know that it's a general rule. But women who are healthier and in better shape generally give birth quicker than women who are not. Right? So you can see that. These women have a hard, vigorous life. And so look, when there's time to give labor, they just do it. It happens. There's an element of truth that it wouldn't surprise me at all if there were times that this had happened, that they'd come and it had already took place. And it was more common to happen among the Hebrews than among the Egyptians for this very reason. It would not surprise me in the least. But really, all of them, we never get there. Then again, it would be like, why do you have a job? What is your duty if you never get there in time? So it just doesn't seem likely that it's an honest answer. The midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. But they stood for righteousness, right? In a sense. They didn't do it perfectly, but they stood we are not going to kill them. We're not. But I will say also, before we go too hard on them, and I think it's a lie that they tell. And I mean, a lie is a lie is a lie. It's never justifiable. But have anyone ever asked you for an explanation of something and you kind of gave an answer that was kind of an answer? It wasn't really exactly, but it was true in some measure. You could say, why did you let them live? Well, I mean, honestly, some of the time, the Hebrew women give birth before we get there. It is more difficult, maybe, to get there in time. Maybe they intentionally delayed. That could be a thing. Maybe they really did do this before, but they thought, oh, so-and-so is giving birth. Okay, well, it's because these are Hebrews. Listen, just so you know, all you midwives, listen, when you get a call for these Hebrew women, we're not going to kill these kids. And so you're going to take your time getting your tools ready, getting your instruments, getting the cloths and the things that you need, right? Stop and get some extra water, show up late. It's very possible. And then they could say this. It would be true, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is, why have you done this? Because we weren't willing to kill them. And the reason it happened is because we intentionally delayed. There's ways to kind of make their answer be truthful, but you can't, there's no way it can be the whole truth. That just can't be. I don't believe that. Now, it's still a lie, right? There's going to be another woman later on who's going to protect some spies in Israel by lying. Right? She's never commended for lying. She's commended for hiding the spies, letting them get out, but never for the lie itself. We have all these hypothetical situations where we think, oh, well, you're going to have to lie. There's no way out of it. I just read or watched an interview of a pastor in Ferguson, Missouri. Any of you know who I'm talking about? This guy? It was wonderful to hear. So 3 men come in with guns to their meeting on a Sunday. He sees it. He didn't know they had guns at first, but come to find out these guys had been robbing stores and come in to rob the church. But he's in there and he sees the men. He was a cop. He's like, something's off about these guys. And so he just begins in his message to come down and kind of address the men in the back. He ends up saying, will you guys mind if we pray for you guys? Can we do it? And like next thing you know, cops show up. These guys are unarmed, and that the whole church, all they had done to disarm the whole situation was to just pray for these men and share the gospel with them. Half people in the church didn't even know what was going on, like that were there. And like that's a lot better than we shot him dead. You know, it's like that seems like a really good answer. I'm not saying it's, if those guys opened fire, somebody probably would have shot at him. But just that wasn't the response. Like, we got these armed men, we're just going to take, like, it was great. Like, you'd say, well, what do you have to do in that situation? You wouldn't think, ask them if we can pray for them and share the gospel with them. You'd think, well, we got to get them disarmed. We got to get people out of here. We got to do all these other things. That's not what happened. God provided. And it's this, I just use that because it's a very recent example. But there are thousands and thousands that we can point to, and which are all very instructive for us, because in all these situations we imagine, we typically take God out of the equation and think, well, how can we make it work? Well, regardless for them, this is what they said. And God dealt well with the midwives because of it. And the people multiplied and grew very strong, and because the midwives feared God, He gave them families. So I think verse 20, God dealt well with the midwives, the first time that's said, I think that means something like He preserved them from Pharaoh's wrath. Like, I think Pharaoh knew this is not believable. But he didn't execute them. He let them go. Most of the time, midwives are those who have either had children of their own, who are raised, or who cannot have children for one reason or another. But here, and the people multiplied and grew very strong, so the people of Israel, despite this edict from Pharaoh, continued to multiply. Not only did they didn't lose numbers, they didn't stay the same, they multiplied. Like, Pharaoh's got to be, just going nuts. Well, thankfully, God dealt well with the midwives, so Pharaoh couldn't harm them. And more than that, because the midwives feared God, rather than Pharaoh, right, we could say, God gave them families. God gave them families. What a precious thing. As they were working, risking their lives to preserve this gift of children and a family for the Israelites, or from their own countrymen if they were Israelites, God saw fit to give them the very blessing itself too. They were not left out. God gave them this thing that they had given up on or had no expectation to have. God gave it to them. What a thing. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So now, if I can't get the midwives to do it, if I can't get my secret police or whatever, right, to do it and be effective, then I'll just command the whole population. If you see a Hebrew baby boy, you throw him in the Nile. You can let a daughter live. Now, how does this work? How is that going to limit them? Well, it's like this. If there's no males, then who are all these females going to marry? Well, they're not going to marry. They're going to be concubines. You're going to own them. And then they're going to have your children. But because they're Hebrew children, they're more slaves. And we can continue to get rid of the boys. We can keep doing whatever we want to do. But we own them all. You see what happens here? They're not going to intermarry and be part of society. They're going to intermarry and keep their slaves. This is the idea. And this happened. Now, I don't want to get into chapter 2, so we'll stop there. Um, you think of this command and what this would look like. I mean, what does it look like to be a Hebrew woman, have a child, and the child begins to cry? And the neighbors come and say, the neighbor Egyptians say, let me see what kind of child you have. And you know why they're asking. They hate you. They're not coming to offer a gift or anything. They just want to see if it's a male or a female. If it's a female, maybe they want to buy it. You're already a slave, so maybe you're living in their quarters anyway. But if they find that male, what are they going to do to him? Toss him in the Nile? Just throw him in the river? How demoralizing this kind of thing would be. We can't imagine. Well, some application. What's the application for this? Well, I mean, again, I think we just got to put ourselves squarely in the place, relate our situation to these Egyptians. They had these great promises about what God was going to do one day. And so do we. Greater promises. But they had right now to endure suffering, which many times was all out of proportion to anything they maybe had done. Hatred from people simply because of who they were. Unfair treatment, harsh treatment, circumstances that just begged the question, is God seeing us at all? This was life for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it just got worse and worse and worse. There were glimpses of things that God did. These midwives, they should have been killed, but they were protected. And this kindness of God to give them families. And you could say that's significant. But what is that in the context of all these families dying, being beaten to death in slavery and worked to death and dying at the age of 30 instead of 60 or 80? Why is that? How is this right? In one sense, it seems like a very small consolation, doesn't it? While we wither away here in Egypt. You could talk about life that way, but Moses says we were prospering, we were expanding, we were growing great and multiplying and filling the place, despite what they were doing to us. In a sense, it's kind of which one are we going to focus on? Are we going to look at those things, those areas in which God is proving Himself again and again to be faithful to us, and remind ourselves of those things, right? Train ourselves on those things to build faith and confidence in what He's promised yet in the future? Or are we going to look at those things where He hasn't revealed to us yet what His plan and purpose is for this thing or that thing, or how long this or that will last, and grow impatient, grow weary in well-doing, unwilling? We're going to dry up when the tribulation comes and cease to bear fruit. Like, which is it? We have to respond one certain way. We have to endure with patience. Let's look at Luke chapter 8. Luke chapter 8. Verse 4. And when a great crowd was gathering and people from town after town came to him, he said in a parable, a sower went out to sow his seed. And as he sowed, some fell along the path and was trampled underfoot, and the birds of the air devoured it. And some fell on the rock, and as it grew up, it withered away, because it had no moisture. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up with it and choked it. And some fell into good soil, and grew and yielded 100-fold. As he said these things, he called out, He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Let's come down to verse 15. As for that in the good soil, they are those who, hearing the word, hold it fast in an honest and good heart, and bear fruit with patience. With patience. Look at verse 13. And the ones on the rock are those who, when they hear the word, receive it with joy, but these have no root, and they believe for a while, and in a time of testing fall away. We must bear fruit with patience. Time of testing, in a time of, think about, like, I believe one of the other Gospels talks about this is when the heat of the sun comes, right? This is this time of testing. The heat of the sun comes and this thing's got no moisture in it, right? So it withers up. Can you imagine like planting a seed and thinking, oh, I think the sun won't get on this one. Like you plant out in the middle of the field, like I wouldn't expect this one to have to endure the sunlight. Of course you do. It's the very nature of being a plant. It just comes. This is part of it. And for Christians, some people, professing Christians, they receive it with joy, and then what naturally, inevitably comes in life, in this world, as naming the name of Christ, comes to them, and they shrivel up. It's just part of being a Christian. You're going to have this opposition. You're going to have times of trial, times of testing. It's just what it is. He warned us about it again and again. The only ones who actually produce are those who hold fast the word with an honest and good heart and bear fruit with patience. That's good soil, bearing fruit with patience. Three other texts I want to quickly look at, and we'll close. Two of them are in Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 12. I said three, there's four other texts. Hebrews chapter 12, just quickly, to remind ourselves of this. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 7. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. You say, I've got to endure this thing. It's so hard. Well, it's for discipline. Like it's meant to teach and train and equip. It's got a purpose. It's discipline. It's for the sake of discipline you have to endure. If you just say, this thing's hard, I quit, there's no discipline. You don't get the benefits of the discipline. But it is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. Can you just put all that together for a moment? Like you have to endure. That does not mean God is not treating you as a son. God is treating you as a son. That's why He's got you under discipline. To equip you, to train you. To make you into something you're not yet. What a thing. There's a lot more we could say from that chapter, but I want to move on for the sake of time. Revelation chapter 13. Revelation 13, verses 3 through 10. Now, no reason to get into disputes about when this is supposed to happen, if it happened already. It's not the point. The point is this. What's written here in Revelation 13, 3 through 10, God expects to happen to His people. Whatever your version of your understanding of this book is, whether it regularly happens to God's people, or whether it one day will happen to them, or whether He's talking about something that happened already. Let's just look. Revelation 13:3. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth... I'll start here. Verse 5. I don't know why I said verse 3. Verse 5. And the beast was given a mouth, uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority. It was allowed to exercise authority. It's in charge. It is determining what happens here. For 42 months. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming His name and His dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also, it was allowed to make war. It was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. How can this be? I thought God was with us. And authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation, and all who dwell on earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb that was slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to be taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword he must be slain. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. You see that? He's telling you, look, this is what happens for this season of time. This earthly power has authority, and it makes war. And it makes war against the people of God. And if anyone is to be taken captive, then to captivity he goes. If he's to be slain and killed with a sword, then he dies with the sword. This is a call for you as a Christian to endure. What a thing. This happens, beloved. This is maybe as similar a kind of thing to what the Israelites were facing in Egypt as I could think of. Just against us. God expects us. God tells us about it ahead of time. This stuff is coming. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 36. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay, but my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. And then last text, 2 Peter chapter 3. 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 to the end. I'll probably make some comment, but we're just going to kind of read through here. 2 Peter chapter 3. But do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. The Lord is not slow to fulfill His promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved in the earth, and the works that are done on it will be exposed. And since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be? In lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn. But according to His promise, we are waiting for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Therefore, beloved, since you are waiting for these, be diligent to be found by Him without spot or blemish and at peace, and count the patience of our Lord as salvation, just as our beloved brother Paul also wrote to you according to the wisdom given him, as he does in all his letters when he speaks in them of these matters. There are some things in them that are hard to understand, which the ignorant and unstable twist to their own destruction, as they do the other Scriptures. You, therefore, beloved, knowing this beforehand, take care that you're not carried away by the error of lawless people and lose your own stability, but grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. To Him be the glory both now and to the day of eternity. Amen. Well, we could say it again. And this is a call for the faithful endurance of the saints. This is life, beloved. We know it, right? I feel like as a church, right? We've said it before, last 4 or 5 years have been hard in a lot of ways. There's been some amazing graces from God among us, and there's been some real hardship that don't appear to be letting up ever. If you say, well, what should we expect? Well, the expectation is just, there's no reason to expect it's going to change other than we just keep praying to God, and God might be gracious and give to the Hebrew midwives' families in the midst of all the stuff. That might happen. Maybe He'll do that for us. He may, in this way or that. He hasn't promised us all those other things, but He has promised us, given us exceedingly great and precious promises. And the call is to endure, to press on, to provoke one another to love and good works, to not give up the habit of meeting together, as is the practice of some, but to encourage one another all the more to see the day drawing near. This is how we respond. It's exactly how these Israelites should have been responding. Some of them surely were. It's not Moses' concern to tell us all about them. He's got a bigger story to tell. He's trying to, again, so much of this is learning about God and God's way and His faithfulness. Well, that's what I have then, just by way of application and explanation of Exodus chapter 1. Next time, Lord willing, we'll be into chapter 2. Are there any questions or comments anybody has? Looks like